what are some of the more common ways that candidates try to bluff their way through Amazon's interviews? And also, interestingly, what techniques do interviewers use to spot these? The first and probably the most common topic would be the use of metrics. The use of metrics in Amazon interviews is quite encouraged. Amazon advertises themselves as a highly data-driven business. They even have one of their favorite rejection reasons is that you're not a data-driven candidate. So you can imagine how people try to make things up around these metrics or try to sell themselves as a metric-driven candidate. Most candidates would assume that these metrics, with the idea of making up metrics would only happen in the results section of your achievements. In my experience, it can happen everywhere during your star answer. For example, I recently had a senior PM with a background in fintech who started presenting themselves, introducing themselves in the job interview using their main achievement, their main highlight. It was a fintech app. They said they trialed that app on 10,000 customers of their bank. And the interviewer became suspicious and asked, hey, why 10,000 and not 20,000? The reason why they said they opened up with the 10,000 customers is because they wanted to impress the interviewer. Say, hey, you know what? I was part of that team. I took the decision, so we trialed that app with 10,000 customers. When in fact, the interviewer tried to prove them, hey, you know what? You weren't as significant in the process as you seem to be suggesting to be. So basically, what's in for you here? When the technique of the candidate would be the use of metrics, and the technique of the interviewer to spot whether you're bluffing on metrics or not would be using challenge questions. Right? So they would challenge you, why 10,000 and not 20,000, these sort of things. And by using challenge questions, they would, eventually determine something. They would determine reasonably well on whether they're happy with the metric that you presented them with. The second scenario where candidates try to make things up, let's say a little bit during these job interviews, would be with respect to decisions they did not fully own. And the most basic example of this is when someone would raise suspicion during a job interview would be a junior software engineer talking about, we achieved the deadline. Okay, so basically, when you say we did achieve the deadline, it doesn't necessarily imply that you led the project, but you were part of the team, so you could say we did this. So obvious, the idea is that you would use I versus we, or you would prefer to use I versus we talking about your achievements to eliminate this type of suspicion. But, for more senior types of roles, there's many times that candidates try to sell themselves as more senior than they actually were in the process by presenting some achievements they didn't fully own, right? So what technique would an interviewer use to spot on whether you're truthful, whether you fully own that decision, whether you actually led that project, program, or solution? That would be the technique of a deep dive. Okay, so it's a very common interviewing technique, probably the most common interviewing technique nowadays in high-performing companies. And basically, they would try to deep proof your expertise on the reasoning that if you did not fully own that decision, then you're very likely not to get stuck while answering some deep dive questions. Right? Now, there's a side effect to this technique of a deep dive during these job interviews. That is, some candidates have some achievements, some decisions maybe that you genuinely did own, but some achievements which happened more than a few years ago. And if this is the case, you might be having a hard time remembering all the key details from that project, program, or solution. So what I would suggest you here would be to prepare some brain dumps. In other words, to try to write all your major achievements in full. It's not unheard of to make a brain dump of 2, 3, 4 pages of one of your best stories, simply because to have all the critically important details to be able to communicate it effectively and to convince your interviewer during a deep dive that you fully own that decision-making process, right? The third topic where, there's an element of not being truthful in these job interviews is for some candidates to sell some projects, some insuccesses as victories during job interviews. And right from the start, I'd like to make a clarification here. I fully understand that real life situations are never perfect. When you have a major achievement in your career, that might have come at a cost with some setbacks and all that stuff. But that's not what I'm referring to here. What I'm referring to here is that some candidates did genuinely talk about some parts of the projects, for example, the first 10 months of a project, which was a success, and then the 11th month, the project get cancelled because it turned out to be not something too successful that worked out for them. Why would you do this in a job interview? Well, because you don't have enough stories, so to speak. But the core idea is that in a job interview, you try to sell yourself on your successes, right? Rather than on your shortcomings. You try to send a message of positivity with these job interviews. Of course, except if they ask you, tell me about the time when you failed, where you sell yourself on your learning and that's it. But I observed this behavior of candidates shooting themselves in the foot, trying to make things up with some insuccess they had, sometimes pretty major insuccesses. But by zooming in to a small part of that, which was a success, they could say, hey, you know what, this could fit earn trust, for instance. And, you know, basically this would not create a dynamic to your advantage. There's also another side of this story that there are some candidates who have some stories that they're having a hard time getting over with, some major conflicts, you know, but due to the fact that they feel, hey, you know what, but this is drama, this sells well. I've heard, you know, that my interview answers don't have to be flat, they must sound exciting. So I believe this is good content. When in fact, you know, you're not doing yourself a favor by talking a project that's an insuccess in this job interviews, of course, except if you're getting asked about insuccess and you know how to sell yourself on that, on your learnings, right? The fourth example I like to share with you here, where you know, candidates are not playing to their advantage, are not interviewing to their advantage, is unethical behaviors, unethical projects, unethical achievements. For example, I've had a candidate who had their best story on customer obsession about a time when they cornered a customer into a deal. Okay, or I once had a director who said, you know, as a cost efficiency method, they had to sell an entire department for being afraid of getting sued. So these sort of behaviors, which are, you know, unethical behaviors by Amazon standards, are not acceptable in their job interviews. So obviously, you know, the fix is obvious, but more interestingly here, it's always, I found in my career that it's always a typology of candidates who are far more likely to come up with unethical examples. That is, with candidates having on their CV companies with suspicious workplaces, right? So if you have Google on your CV, you have nothing to be afraid of. You know, the environment there is quite ethical. But if you have Comcast in your CV, you maybe want to expect to get tested on ethical behaviors in Amazon's interviews. And again, this came also to me a little bit of surprise. Also, international candidates are far more likely to present examples of unethical behaviors when compared to others. This also I was quite surprised of in these job interviews. Also, if you know yourself that you have a CV, a problematic CV, so to speak, try to interview a little bit more slowly if you can. So you maybe spot these early on if they're specifically interested in testing you with these things. And the fifth thing I like to talk about here about unethical behaviors or candidates being untruthful in Amazon's interviews. This is a trending topic in interviews with any company these days. That is AI candidates, or what I call AI candidates. This could be packaged in many shapes or forms, from AI rewarded answers, into which you must be aware of that AI rewarded answers sound like AI rewarded answers. If you'd only do some coaching sessions, or if you'd only record yourself, you would figure this out. There's also other extremes of candidates reading their AI answers from their computer screens or using AI assistants during these job interviews. and all these sort of things. My recommendation to you would be to consider the following commentary here. The first thing that Amazon interviewers look out for in Amazon interviews is whether you're an AI candidate. The first thing, that is even before you bluffing on metrics and all that stuff. The second thing that you should consider here is that there are candidates, like a minority of candidates, who take advantage of AI to give great answers during a job interview. But what happens in most cases is candidates get dominated by AI advice. In other words, the bar of your interviewing skills will be determined by the AI, not by the quality of your stories, which is another very dangerous trend to be in. And the last commentary here is that Amazon is a notable exception to this, but many high-performing companies, to the likes of Google, NVIDIA, Microsoft, and many others, are explicitly warning candidates publicly on their job's website against the use of AI in their job interviews, not because they have an interest to help you, but because they observed that perfectly qualified candidates are shooting themselves in the foot by using AI in these interviews. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.